Okay, now to the second part of the assignment. This is more complicated. You got to have your head in the ball game. Now you're going to be dealing with variables, and there's going to be numbers with the variables and all that, okay? Now, look at your expression. You have y to the third power. I'm going to circle the 3 in a parentheses. Outside you have a fifth power times y to the seventh power. So if I ignore the exponents, the operation is just times. So if all I have is times or divide as an operation without any pluses and minuses, I like to simplify it in 3 steps. These are fraction lines. Now you're like, well, why would you put that? You'll see how it works here as I move through the 8 examples. Now, if your expression does not have a fraction line, you underline the whole thing. So it's like having something over 1, but you're not going to put the 1. So if I take out the exponents, what are my factors? Y times y. So I write y down, that's my first factor, and my second factor is another y, which means I will just add the powers together. So the first y is to the third, but it is in parentheses, so I have to distribute 3 to 5, which is 15, and the second y is to the seventh. Not in parentheses, so that one doesn't get distributed. So 15 plus 7 is 22, so we have y to the 22nd power. Now, do you have anything on bottom? You don't. There was nothing on bottom for me to write, so I move on to this line. Now, what is that power? Is it negative or positive? It looks positive to me, so it stays right where it's at. Now, the third line, can you possibly simplify y to the 22nd power? I don't think you can because you don't have what the y equals. So you can't simplify. There's your answer. Okay. Next problem. So the first line is writing my factors, knowing what their exponents are. The second line is if that is a negative exponent, I would reciprocate it, but it wasn't, so it stayed where it was at. And the third line is for simplifying the exponents that I possibly can. Okay, my next problem. Now there's a division line there. That's okay. We have on top we have m to the negative fourth. On bottom we have m to the third times m to the negative second. What factors do you have on top? You have an m. And it's m to the negative fourth, okay? That's really the only power. It doesn't need to be distributed. It ain't in a parentheses. Now on bottom, what are my factors? We have an m, and then there's another m, so I put a plus sign, and I take the 3 plus the negative 2. Now 3 plus negative 2 is 1. Put a 1 right there. Now, when we have a bottom, when we actually have things on bottom, we want to compare it to the top and see if we can cross out something right here. I have an m on top and an m on bottom, so one of the m's I cross out because I'm dividing. Cross out the m to the smaller power, okay? Negative 4 is a smaller power than 1. So, you take out your negative m to the negative 4 and subtract parentheses negative 4 from 1. It's not just 1 minus 4 because it's 1 minus negative 4. 1 minus negative 4 is 5. How? Because 1 minus negative 4 is the same as 1 plus 4, which is 5. So at the end we have m to the fifth. Is it a positive fifth? Indeed it is. So it stays exactly where it's at. It's on bottom now. It stays on bottom. Now, m to the fifth cannot be simplified, so since that cannot be simplified, we just bring it over. But when the top is empty, we need to put a 1 over it, okay? Up here, I don't need to put 1 on the bottom, but when the top's empty, you have to put a 1 over it, because it is a fraction. Okay, my next problem. Negative 5, x to the third. And then in a parentheses, negative 5x to the third. Then outside parentheses, we have a second power times 4, and then x to the third power. So, here are what I have. Negative 5 and x, that's times, when there's no symbol. x and 4, the times dot's there, 4 and x, so it's all times again. So I make my 3 lines, and I underline the expression. Now, it's all on top, there's nothing on bottom, so the first factor I have is -5. Now, if you have a negative base factor, you want to put a parentheses around it, just trust me. Then we have an x factor. I write out all my factors. Then we have a 4 factor. And then another x factor, so that means I can just add to the first x factor. Put a little plus sign. So now let's figure out what all these exponents are. So -5, you're like, well, what's the power on the -5? A 1. And it's in a parentheses, so I do the inside-outside multiplication. I have to distribute. 1 times 2 is 2. Now x, we know there's 2 of them we have to add, so start at the one on the left. You take the inside times the outside. 3 times 2 is 6, and on the other x factor it's just a 3, so 6 plus 3 is 9. And then the 4, well, it would be 4 to the first, but it's not in a parentheses, so since it's not in a parentheses, I just put it to the first. Okay. Now, here are my exponents. That exponent's positive, so that's power stays on top. This exponent's positive, then it stays on top. This exponent's positive, it stays on top. So they all stayed on top because all the exponents are positive. I don't care if the base is a negative, it's the exponent. Now, I think you can simplify a couple of these, like -5 to the second and 4 to the first. Because -5 to the second is -5 times -5, and that's 25. So that's replaced with 25, and then 4 to the first is replaced with 4. And then the variable factor can't be simplified, so that trails. Now, there's one more thing we can do. We can take the 25 times the 4, okay? And that's 100. Now, you can't times by x to the 9th because you don't know what x is, but you can simplify that. Okay, this one looks complicated, but if you follow your rules, it's not that bad. You have a division line. On top you have 6a to the 4th and b to the 5th. And under the division line you have ab. Then you have a multiplication operation. Then a parentheses inside you have a division line. On top you have 2ab. On bottom you have a to the second, b to the second. And then there's a third outside the parentheses. Okay? So, what are the operations? Well, first off, you combine that into one big line. With multiplication, you can do that. Okay, combine it into one fraction. So it's 6 times a times b times 2, you see the dot, times a times b. Then on bottom, a times b, a times b. So it's all multiplication. It's good to know, so this will work. So what are your factors on top? You have a 6. You have an A, you have a B, you have a 2, you have a second A factor, so plus, and you have a second B factor, so I put a plus. Now let's figure out what these powers are, then we're going to go to the bottom. So 6 is to the 1, first power, if there's no exponent, we put a 1. It doesn't get distributed because it's not in a parenthesis, so it's just 1. Okay. Now a, the first a is to the 4th, not distributed, and the second a right here is to the 1, but that does need to be distributed. 1 times 3, that would be 3, and 4 plus 3 makes 7, okay? Now b, we know there are 2 b factors. I wouldn't have put a plus sign if there weren't. So the first factor is to the 5, and the second factor a 1, but we got to distribute. 1 times 3 is 3, 5 plus 3 is 8. Then the 2 factor, well, it's to the 1, but again, like all the rest of this, it's in parentheses, so 1 times 3 is 3. Now, there is stuff on the bottom. We have a factor of a factor of b, another factor of a, so I'll just add, and another factor of b, so I'll just add. So a is to the 1 there. So it's going to be a 1, and then the other a is to the second, but it needs to be distributed because it's in a parentheses. So 2 times 3 is 6. We take it times the 3 out there. 1 plus 6 is 7. Now on the b, we got a 1 right there, so 1 is your first one. Then 2 times 3 is 6, so 1 plus 6 is 7. Okay, that's a 7. Here, I'll put it so you can see it better. 7. Now, when you have stuff on bottom, you need to see if you can cross it out. Like you have an A and an A. One of those can go. Well, in this case, since they have the same exponent value, they both go. Because 7 minus 7 cancels. They're gone. Now we also have b to the 7th. Is there a b on top? Yeah, b to the 8th. So 7's smaller than 8, so I take the b to the smaller power out and subtract it from the other side. 8 minus 7 then is 1. So what do I have? I have 6 to the 1st, b to the 1st, and 2 to the 3rd. All those are positive exponents, so they all maintain their position. Okay. And then the last line is to simplify what I can. So 6 to the 1st can be simplified, and so can 2 to the 3rd. So 6 to the 1st is 6, and 2 to the 3rd would be 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. So this becomes 6, this becomes 8. And then the variable needs to trail at the end. You can put b if it's to the 1st, you can just put b. Okay, I'm going to put the 1st so people can see it. Then 6 times 8 is 48. 48 times b to the 1st. Okay, and my second problem, or my fifth example. So division line's there, and you got 3 on top. On bottom you have a parentheses just on bottom with a negative 2x inside and a power of negative 5. That's a negative 5 on bottom. So what are your operations? Well, you got 3, you got the division, and you have negative 2 times x. So again, so on top you have a base of 3. That's the only factor you got. It's to the 1st, and it will remain to the 1st because it's not in the parentheses. Now on bottom we have a negative 2 factor, put it in parentheses, followed by an x factor. Now, put a 1. 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. Put a 1 on x. 1 times negative 5 is negative 5. Okay, now let's look at the top. Well, that's positive. It maintains its position. Okay, and by the way, you can't cross out anything because you have a negative 2 on bottom, but you don't have that base on top. And likewise with the x, it's on bottom, but it ain't on the top. Okay, now on bottom you have negative exponents, so they do not stay in their same position. Okay, you move the factor of negative 2 to the other side, which is on bottom now. Moving it to the other side would take it to the top. It still stays negative 2, but its exponent becomes positive 5. Now, the x has a negative exponent, so it has to be reciprocated. That means move it to the other side, so it's on bottom. The opposite of bottom's the top, and then it becomes 5. Okay? Now, we're good. So that's why those negative exponents have to be reciprocated. Move them to the side that they're not. They've got to switch positions. So we can rewrite them as positives. So 3 to the 1st is just 3. Okay? This and this gets simplified. Negative 2 to the 5th, well, that would be negative 2. Now, if you're going to use the caret key, fine, but you got to put a parentheses around it if it's negative. It's negative 32. And then my variable trails. Now, you can multiply these two. If you can multiply a couple factors, do it. 3 times negative 32 is negative 96 times x to the 5th. Okay, my next problem. We have 3x to the negative 3rd power, y to the 14th power. So, what are the operations? Well, that's times and that's times, so it's all times again. And then I underline the expression. So on top, my factors are 3, x, and y, one of each. There are no factors on bottom, at least for now. Okay, so 3 to the 1st. Now, it doesn't get distributed because it's not in parentheses. x to the negative third. Doesn't get distributed because it's not in the parentheses. 14 doesn't get distributed, okay? And bottom's empty. I don't have to do anything on bottom. Okay. Now, that's a positive exponent. It maintains its position. That is a negative exponent. It has to switch positions. Bottom to top, top to bottom. This one will go top to bottom, so it can become a 3. Positive maintains its position. Now, out of these on top, 3 to the first can be simplified. That's just 3. And then times y to the 14th. And on bottom, you have x to the third. Is there anything you could possibly multiply? No, you can't. The only multiplication you got is this, and you don't know the y value, so it's done. Okay, next problem. We have a parentheses. Inside, we have 3x to the third power, y to the negative third power, and then the parentheses is closed, and then outside you have a negative fourth power. So I underline the expression because it's all times again. Now, what factors we got on top? Well, 3x and a y. What factors do you have on the bottom? Nothing, okay? So let's talk about 3. It's to the first, and it's in a parentheses, so you distribute 1 to negative 4. So it's actually 3 to the negative 4th. Now the x, 3. 3 times negative 4, negative 12. Y, negative 3 times negative 4 is positive 12. Now we're good. That's a negative exponent. It has to switch positions so that its exponent can be written as a positive, okay? Negative 12, switch positions so that its exponent can become a positive. Y to the 12th maintains its position because it's already a positive exponent. Okay, out of these exponents, I can only simplify the 3 to the 4th. You can't simplify anything on top, but the 3 to the 4th can be simplified. That's 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, and that's 81. So this becomes 81. This cannot be simplified. Anything you can multiply? I don't think so, because the only thing I have multiplying is 81 times x to the 12th. Since I don't know x, can't do that. Okay, last problem. You have a division line. On top, you have a parentheses that just surrounds the 5x, and then outside you have a negative third power. And then you have y to the 7th. And then under the division line, you have x to the negative 7th, and you have y to the negative 4th. So, what are your operations? 5 times x times y, x times y. See, when I'm putting the operators in, I just ignore the exponents at that point. So it's all multiplication, division. It's all one factor. It's simplifying a monomial, one whole term, I should say. A plus or a minus makes it into 2 terms, but that's a different story. Okay, so factor on top, we got a 5. Then we have an x factor. Then we have a y factor. Now, what are we going to have on top? Well, 5's to the 1. 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. Now I move on to the x. That's also to the 1. 1 times negative 3 is negative 3. This y is to the 7th, so I will maintain it as I will put it as 7 because it's not in a parentheses. Now, you got stuff on bottom. Your factors are x and y, okay? So once you do the top, you go to the bottom and repeat the same process. So x, negative 7, and then y, negative 4. Now, when you have stuff on bottom, you see what you can cross off. Well, I have an x and an x. One of those got to go. It's going to be the negative 7 because it's smaller. So I subtract parentheses negative 7. Well, that's the same as negative 3 plus 7 when you minus a negative number. Okay, that's basic algebra. Negative 3 plus 7 is 4. Now, you also have a y on bottom, and you got a y on the top too. 7 and negative 4. I think the negative 4 would go. So I put minus parentheses negative 4. Now, if I'm minusing a negative, it's really 7 plus 4, which is 11. Okay, which exponents need to be reciprocated? Ooh, that's a negative. That can't stay there. It's got to go to the other side. It becomes a positive. That's staying. Positive, no reason to move it. That's positive, no reason to move it. Okay, so again, if it's positive, it maintains its position. If it's a negative, it goes to the opposite side of the fraction or division line, so I can rewrite it as a positive. Now, out of all these, I can simplify 5 to the third. That would be 5 times 5 times 5. Be 125. This is replaced with 125, and the variables stay the way they are. And there's nothing I can multiply there because the only times I have is with x and y, which I don't know what those are. Now, one thing on the assignment, number 5, this is 3x, and outside of the parentheses is a negative fourth power. Okay, 3x, negative fourth power outside.